Okay, we are live. Let me just turn on Rockfin. One second, everybody. I'm waiting for Rockfin to give me the green light
Mm.
to go live. All right, and Rockfin is a go as well. Welcome, everybody, to another live stream. We have with us the Oracle of London, Mr. Alexander Mercouris, and we are very happy to have one of our most favorite of all guests, Mr. Garland Nixon. Garland, how are you doing today?
Wonderful. Thanks for inviting me again, guys.
Mm.
Fantastic. And we have all of Garland's information in the description box down below where you can find him and follow him. And I will add it as a pinned comment as well. Once the stream is over, a quick hello to everyone on Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, theduran.locals.com, on YouTube as well, and to our amazing moderators, Spartan Warrior Queen, Zarael. Who else? Let's see. Spartan Warrior Queen, Zarael, and myself. We will be moderating this stream. So let's get moving. Zelensky, or Zelensky, if you're Biden, his victory speech in Congress yesterday, actually a big day in general, a lot of stuff going on over the past couple of days.
Yeah.
So let's break it all down. Garland, I'm going to steal one of your phrases. Let's talk. Alexander, Garland, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm going to just start by saying that there was a very big day yesterday, and the least important part of it was Zelensky's speech to Congress, which I thought was, somebody once said a phalanx of cliches crawling across a page. I mean, it was absolute empty air as far as I could see. He said nothing that was interesting, nothing that was new. He talked a lot about Bakhmut, and we talked about Bakhmut, and of course he went to Bakhmut, or so it's said. We don't quite know where he was, but anyway, the assumption is he went to Bakhmut, and he came back to Washington. It's now absolutely clear that his entire visit to Bakhmut was basically a prop for this speech that he did, but he didn't say anything. And I'm going to say something else. I think he probably came away from that visit personally disappointed, because what he got was a Patriot missile system, which Garland and Scott Ritter have already talked about in a great program, but it's not going to deliver the goods as far as Zelensky's concerned. He didn't get very much more, actually. I mean, he got $44 billion, but given the amount that Ukraine is spending and the weapon systems that he's using, I don't think he came out with very much. So I thought it was the least important event of yesterday. The whole Zelensky visit was the least important event. Big events going on in Moscow, where Putin and Shoigu were addressing the entire military, 15,000 military leaders, and a massive Russian build-up, industrial, economic expansion of the army, conduct of the war in Ukraine, all that going on. And of course, the other big event, which I know Garland is particularly, tuned to, follows Medvedev's trip to Beijing, which we're not being told very much about it. Well, I think it's the most consequential of all, because straight away, Xi Jinping does not meet one-to-one people who are not heads of state. And those who say that he met Medvedev because he was the head of the United Russia Party, and Xi Jinping is the head of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore that explains why the two men met. That's absolutely not the case. And making it completely clear, this is a policy discussion, is the fact of who else was in that meeting. And we know that Wang Yi, who was the foreign minister of China, the man in charge of overall relations with Russia, he was certainly present, and probably all sorts of other people were. So it was probably in the end the most important event of yesterday, but the one we know least about.
Yes, and I'll add the Russians made sure to make it clear to the world that they were maintaining protocol, because one of the messages that came out was he was bearing a message from President Putin, and he took a message from President Xi Jinping to President Putin. So they maintained the respect and protocol for China by stating he was a messenger for the head of state. And I think that maintained the due respect for the Chinese leader. I think a couple of things important that I took from yesterday. Number one, I thought about a year or so ago, or not quite a year ago, where the Germans announced this gigantic military buildup that they were going to do. They were going to become a world power, etc. And a few months ago, they quietly announced, we can't afford it anymore, so we're not going to do it. At the same time, the Russians, who are, I mean, literally making a fortune due to U.S. sanctions, due to the actions taken, the economic actions that are driving up the very commodities that they make a living off of, are announcing we're going to dramatically build up our defensive capabilities. I think this also says something else to me. One of the things that, this is what I take from it, I don't know about Alexander, one of the things that the Russians, let's put two things together. Last December, the Russians sent a formal written request for security on their border and for diplomatic discussion about security on their border. Since then, the Russians have made it very clear we don't trust the West. For, you know, we could talk about Petro Poroshenko's comment, Angela Merkel's comment, but it's been made clear to the Russians that they can't trust the Western leaders for any diplomatic solution to those same security issues on their border. I think what we're seeing the Russians do now and say now is two things. They're making a fortune, and that's not going to change. And if anything, the continued actions from the West are going to drive up the amount of money that they bring in. So I think what the Russians are really saying now is, we cannot trust a deal with you for security on our border. We can't afford it, and we're going to do it. We're going to, utilizing our military abilities, we're going to guarantee the security on our border defensively, because we can't trust you for a deal. And even if we get a deal with you, we don't trust it. So we're going to do it ourselves. So I think the meeting in DC and the meeting, the things that were being done by the Russians are inextricably linked, in that the puppet, the proxy army for the West was saying, we want more money, because the West's war is with money. It's that capital. We believe that we can use money and we can defeat Russia. The Russian war is with artillery. The Russian war is with, and again, it's that financialized, magical of thinking, where, you know, you just say what women or men are, you just say what money is or what anything is, and it magically it's that kind of thinking versus commodities and industry and artillery. And I think we saw those two things, contradictions, come together yesterday.
Absolutely. And can I just amplify all the things? I don't know whether you've read the transcripts that the Russians are providing of Putin's speech, but he made all exactly the same points that you've just made. He spoke at enormous length about the fact that the West simply cannot be trusted. So did Shoigu, the defense minister. Shoigu actually brought up Angela Merkel. He said, you know, we now know, because of what Angela Merkel said, that the West was never serious about the Minsk agreement. And Putin went through all of the various agreements, all the various attempts he and other Russian leaders have made to get on with the West. He said, we made attempt after attempt. He was almost apologizing to the Russian people and to the Russian military for the fact that he'd persisted in these attempts for so long. And he said exactly what you said. And the whole tone of that meeting yesterday was, we can't trust them. They're agreement incapable. If we enter into an agreement with them, they will simply break it. And Putin actually gave an example. He gave the example of this agreement that was made on the 21st of February 2014 between Yanukovych and the Maidan movement, which was brokered by Poland, France, and Germany, which was supposed to lead to elections by the end of 2014. And what happened? The Poles, the Germans, and the French guaranteed that agreement. Within hours, it was broken, and Yanukovych was overthrown. And what did the French, the Germans, and the Poles do? They just said, well, you know, that's it. agreement doesn't matter anymore. We can forget about it. And Putin is obviously furious about this. He's seething about this, but he's not the only Russian who is. And the scale of what the Russians are going to do is really, I mean, you have to read through what Putin was saying. And he was very careful to make exactly the point that you were making, Garland. Russia can afford it. It's not going to go down the Soviet route. It's not going to militarize its economy or society. It now has the resources. Its economy is far better organized. It's got the means to do it. It's got the resources to do it. It's got the technology to do it. He said very few other countries are in our position where we can do these things. We can do them, and we are going to do them. And they're going to increase the size of their army. They're going to build up their military industries. There's going to be a massive increase in arms production next year. And remember, we're talking about next year. There's already a big increase in arms production this year, but what's coming next year is going to dwarf it. And, to be frank, one Patriot missile system, more or less, looks pretty insignificant compared to all of that. And that's not even adding on whatever China might do. And Garland, you may not know this, but there's been a very interesting article in The Guardian, the British newspaper, The Guardian, which was from somebody who works for the Royal United Services Institute, which is the British Army's, the British military's think tank. And he said there's a real risk in sending even one Patriot missile system to Ukraine because we are desperately so short of Patriot missiles, something that Brian Beletic has been already saying. We are very short of Patriot missiles. There aren't enough of these things to go around because our production systems are so bad. We can't keep the Saudis supplied, and we don't already have enough in the Far East to counter the Chinese. So quite apart from the problems of the Patriot missile system, which you and Scott discussed, there just aren't enough of them already. And the problem is when we give weapons to Ukraine, Ukraine just uses them in a totally profligate way. And again, this person in The Guardian, this person from the United Services Institute, he specifically referred to the HIMARS, that the Ukrainians launch far more of these than they ever said that they would. They do it in a very prodigal, indiscriminate way, and then they always come back for more. And the result is that ammunition, weapon system stocks in the West become depleted, and the fear is that with the Patriot, they will do the same. They will shoot their Patriot missiles at everything, every target. They won't be discriminating. Of course, that isn't even consider the problem that you were identifying on that program, that the Russians only need to lob one single hypersonic missile and the whole thing goes foot. But in some ways, from a Western point of view, it would be even more dangerous if it was just left there. You have all these cruise missiles, all these drones coming, and the Ukrainians just went firing missiles at these, and just depleted their stocks, and then came back and asked for more. And the US would then find itself faced with a dilemma. Do we go on supplying more, deplete our resources even further in the Far East against the Chinese, let our Saudi proteges, as they still are that, down by not supplying them with the missiles they need, or do we finally say enough? So it's a very extraordinary situation that the first time in history the West is outgunned. Its industrial resources are not up to the challenge. And that article in the Royal United Services Institute, in The Guardian, essentially said that, made precisely that point.
Yeah, and a couple of things. And that is the result of, that is the ultimate reality of of neoliberalism. When you deindustrialize yourself and your industry becomes a hollow shell, then it's not, again, it's like not anything there. It's not real. There's the appearance that you have a great industrial capacity for military, but in reality, they're just trying to make as much money as they can, as quick as they can. They don't care if the equipment works, and they don't care how much they can make, as long as they can create enough of it to make money. And now that there is a reality there, they're unable to keep up with it. A couple of things, I think. In a way, Angela Merkel's statement was one of the greatest gifts that could be given to the Russians, because keep in mind, before this war started, Sergei Lavrov said that the U.S., when they say the West or whatever, they mean the U.S. empire, that the U.S. was agreement incapable. I'm probably using the wrong word, but that's specifically what he meant. And so the Russians, before this started, and in fact, they made statements last December when they released the list of written demands for a discussion. They made statements then that said, well, we know they're not going to pay any attention to them, but we're going to release them and give them to them and give them an opportunity. So they already knew this. What this allows them to do, what Angela Merkel's statement allows the Russians to do, is because one of the very important things is they're allies. They're allies in the global South. They're allies in Asia, etc. They have to continue to maintain a strong moral high ground, a moral argument for what they're doing, in light of a number of things that we can go on forever, but they've got to maintain that. This allows them to maintain that argument, to put an exclamation on the argument and say, you see, we told you that we couldn't trust these people, and that a number of the decisions that we were made is because we know we can't trust them. Here's the evidence, Exhibit A. Everybody read it. Everybody look at it. What do we have to say anymore? So Angela Merkel just handed the Russians the gift that keeps on giving. Petro Poroshenko had made the statement, but he's not really a credible actor. He's just seen as, a U.S. puppet. God knows he'll say anything he wants, anything on any given day. Angela Merkel was a person, you may disagree with her politics, but she was a highly respected political figure worldwide. When she says it, it's game, set, and match. The Russians can play that card for as long as they play. And it's not really playing a card, because now she has given them a reality that they've already, they've said. I do think it is important to connect the dots between Medvedev going to China and coming back, and Putin announcing this gigantic military buildup. I don't think those things are inconsequential, the timing of it. I do think that it signals a discussion between Russia and China. And there's also talk floating around of a more formal military alliance between the two of them. I don't know if it's going to happen. I do know they are reticent to create a world of two blocks. I know they know the neocons would love to have, okay, there's the Warsaw Pact and us again, hooray, we've got the band back together. And they want to avoid that. But I do think, I don't know what you think about it, I do think that these discussions are very linked, and that to me, the biggest event of the day was Medvedev going to China and back. Also, in light of the last time the Chinese and Russian leaders had a big discussion was just before the special military operation. I think there's something afoot. I don't know what, and there may not be. It may have simply been, okay, we're going to make our big military buildup. I'm going to make that announcement. I want to let you know, to give you the respect as my better than ally, better than friend. This is what I'm going to do, dear friend, and then do it. And it could have been as simple as that.
Yeah, right. A lot of things that you've just been saying, Garland. And I'm going to ask you a few other things, actually, but because I'd like you to discuss about the internal politics of the US in a moment. But firstly, you use the word hollow to describe our military industrial base in the West. The person who wrote that article in The Guardian, he used exactly that same word, hollow, that it's become hollow. He was saying it's very urgent to try to repair this, but of course it won't happen quickly enough for Ukraine. And of course, to do that would mean a complete change and the whole economic civilization we now have in the West. It's not going to happen. I mean, that's the reality of it. So that was what he said. And the second about Merkel, and that this is the gift that gives on giving, because it's come from the German chancellor. Again, about a week ago, Putin said exactly that. He said, Poroshenko had already admitted it, but nobody took that seriously. I was horrified, shocked when I saw that it was the federal chancellor of Germany was party to this kind of thing. Now, of course, he wasn't. I mean, he must have worked out pretty early on that Merkel wasn't being serious about it. But you're absolutely right. They can now bring that up at every opportunity. Now, let's talk about the Medvedev Xi Jinping meeting. There was an exchange of letters. We're never going to see these letters, but we do know that they are letters. They're letters from the president of China, the president of Russia, and from the president of Russia to the president of China. Now, they don't need to send letters to each other. They can speak on the phone. There must be all kinds of secure links. So they've put something in writing to each other. Now, what is that which they have put in writing to each other? An agreement of some kind? Who knows? But bear in mind that Medvedev is the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, as well as being the head of the United Russia Party. And he appears to have some kind of supervisory role over Russia's military industries. I mean, one of the things you see him most often do is he tours the various factories, he meets the managers, he's the person who seems to be the person they report to about how, the munitions production is going. And he seems to have some kind of a role in that. And of course, we have Xi Jinping's comments to Medvedev, very bland, uninformative Chinese readouts, which is interesting in itself because they can't possibly tell us exactly what the two men were saying. When they're so bland, doesn't seem to mean very much. But we do see Xi Jinping saying that this partnership between China and Russia, partnership for the new era, we're going to consolidate it, we're going to build on it, and we're going to take it further still. Further still towards what? Is there some kind of an alliance? Of course, there was a big article in the British magazine, The Spectator, which claimed that there's already a military component to this, that they've each committed themselves to coming to the defense of the other in the event that there is some kind of an attack on either one of these countries. But we don't know. And the only thing that's interesting, the thing that is really interesting is that, there was this exchange of letters. And those letters, the text of them, almost certainly agreed in advance. A commitment of some kind from one to the other in those letters, a written commitment, who knows? But not impossible at all, I would say. Now, Garland, there was something that you said again in that program, which I'd like to explore with you. You talked about the fact that there are many different factions in Washington, including many different neocon factions. And we do have, it seems to me, discordant voices. We now have an article, for example, in the Washington Post, of all places, saying Russia is not responsible for the Nord Stream sabotage. So it looks, which of course leaves open the question of who in that case was. We have this article in The Guardian from Jack Watling of the Royal United Services Institute. We have different kinds of articles appearing in the US media, some saying the military situation is very bad for Ukraine, others, that they're marching towards victory. What do you think is going on in Washington, and where does the president, if he actually exists, where does he stand?
I think number one, I think there are, for all of the bravado that they speak, that they talk in public, I think they understand a lot of them understand the realities. At least there are elements that understand the realities. I would say this: the Washington Post is known to be a kind of a CIA based group. I would argue that what we're hearing is a CIA, because let's face it, while we don't know who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, Tony Blinken has made some statements that would imply his fingerprints may be found around there. And he wrote a book, The Ally versus Ally, in which he argued against the Russian the Siberian pipelines back in the 1990s. We know the CIA literally blew those up back then. So certainly one could think State Department. So what it sounds like to me is the CIA throwing an elbow at the State Department saying, look, that probably wasn't a good idea. We don't approve of it. We didn't like it when it happened. The intelligence agency is pushing back against the State Department. Those are those two factions that want to go in different directions. The CIA always likes the soft power things. They always like the, information wars and things of that nature, where Tony Blinken types, they're the knuckle draggers. They want to just take a club and hit you over the head, therefore blowing up the pipeline. So I think those were the arguments that we were seeing. Joe Biden is an old school neocon. I think when you look at Joe Biden, you're looking at the old school neocons, the old Scoop Jackson wing of the Democratic Party, the Cold War Democrats, who back then argued that their problem with Russia was ideological because it was communist. But then Russia's no longer communist and they still hate Russia. So it's been outed. The reality is they had the same problem with Russia then that they do now. And that is they want to control the world, and Russia is powerful enough to stop them from controlling everything. That Russia is an alternative power. Historically, they hated Russia because Russia was in Africa and in the Soviet Union, Africa, arming the Sandinistas. They were doing things to push back against the empire. So that's Joe Biden. He's just a guy from the 1950s or 60s who has found his way to power now. And he doesn't understand, I believe, the current dynamics that are extremely complicated.
I mean, he doesn't engage in any kind of diplomacy, but he's still nonetheless telling Zelensky, well, you're not going to get everything you want. You're not going to get your long-range missiles, for example. He seems to be ruling all that out. So is there a push-pull? I mean, I get the sense that the Pentagon, or at least some people in the Pentagon, are getting worried. They must be getting worried that their ammunition stocks are getting depleted. They must be worried that they're facing threats in the East, in Asia, from China potentially, which they might not be able to respond to, because everything's being shipped over to Ukraine. And is there some kind of push-pull? Are there some people in Washington who are saying, really, we feel that this is going too far, we want to bring it under some kind of control, with others saying, no, we must go all the way? And are there arguments about the role of Zelensky and Zelensky? And is there some people who say, well, Zelensky is the person to count on, and so the other side brings Zelensky to Washington because they want to make it sure that it's Zelensky who's going to be the continued leader of Ukraine because, well, he's the person that we trust. I mean, do you get the sense that there's a lot of this going on? Because I do, to be honest. It looks to me like behind the facade, behind the curtain, everybody is fighting everybody in Washington. At least that's my sense.
You're absolutely right. As you have said many times, the U.S. is able to maintain a level of discipline amongst its puppet leaders throughout the what I would call the colonies of Europe. However, in the belly of the beast, there is, as you have discussed, you are correct. There's a much more robust discussion in the United States about the wisdom of continuing with the Ukraine project than there is in Europe. So therefore, you've got a number of things. You've got Tucker Carlson going on Fox, literally calling Zelensky a strip club manager. I mean, the guy comes to Congress with a wrinkly sweatsuit shirt on. That's the people. Trust me, I've done work on Capitol Hill. The people in Congress on Capitol Hill are very, very concerned about those. They may not say it, but when they look at that doesn't go over big. They're looking at this guy. They bring him in, and he comes in, and you have the Republicans with a struggle. McCarthy is trying to become this is big because McCarthy is trying to become the Speaker of the House. but he doesn't have enough votes. They only need a few to put him down. I think that's one of the big issues you're looking at right now. The Republican Party has a huge problem. Mitch McConnell comes out and says, the goal of the Republicans is Ukraine first, Ukraine second, Ukraine third. Well, that's a hint that no, that isn't, that he's got big problems, and that's why he has to say that. So now they're trying to figure out how they're going to get anyone in as a Speaker of the House, knowing that there is an element in the Republican Party large enough to thwart their ability to govern that does not want to move forward with this Ukraine thing. So the Republican Party, and of course the mainstream Democrats and Republicans who want to keep forward with this project know this is a dynamic that they're going to have to deal with. And I don't think they have any idea how to deal with that. And so they're wrestling right now with, how do we get a Republican Speaker in the House in power that's on board with the neocon project in Ukraine? And that's a very, very going to be a very difficult road with a handful of people saying no. And if they can't just say, well, we'll just get enough Democrats to jump over with the rest. That's suicide for whoever comes to power. They can't come to power based on votes of the Democrats. So I think that's a big part of what we're looking at, trying to figure out how House leadership comes together in a way that still supports Ukraine, with Tucker Carlson out there throwing a monkey wrench at it at every opportunity that he gets.
I mean, why this obsession with Ukraine? I mean, I've seen somebody, I mean, you know, this is a Republican's perspective, but there was a tweet that I saw with somebody who said, you find $100 billion for Ukraine, you can't find $5 billion for a border wall. Now, I'm going to discuss whether the border wall was a good idea, but it was a Republican, project, if you like. And it is the case that McConnell was, shall we say, unenthusiastic about it, but he's now telling everybody that Ukraine is the priority for Republicans. Why? I mean, is it the money? Is it he's getting all the money, or is it because this is part of now of a factional battle within the Republican Party that, lowering support for Ukraine is now becoming, and increasing support for Ukraine is becoming a badge of loyalty? If you support Ukraine, you're a McConnell loyalist. If you oppose that, then you're somehow an insurrectionist. Is this what's happening to the Republican Party?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. Keep in mind something. So you've got the lefties, and I mean real lefties like myself, who are screaming, you can find $45 billion for Ukraine, but people need health care, or poor people need food, or things of that nature, right? You've got the conservatives with their various projects, whether it's a border wall or whatever. So you've got people screaming from all sides of the aisle, you can find all of this money for Ukraine, but we want X, and we can't get it. So there's pressure coming from all directions now on that, and I think they can't really figure out how to square that. The other problem they've got is this Ukraine. You had the big Afghanistan debacle. Ukraine is setting up for the mother of all debacles now. Because they've put everything on it. This is the neocons in Washington have put we're going to do this. This is going to work. We're going to take Russia, everything all of their credibility was put on Ukraine. If they stop, they know if they stop supporting Ukraine that it's over quickly. This thing is over, and it may be anyway. We don't know, but they know the direction this thing is going, and they're trying to prop it up as long as they can, because if this thing falls apart, what do they say to Europe? Europe's sitting there saying, we're cold, we're hungry, the people are enraged, they have exposed to the Europeans that their leaders are not acting on behalf of their constituency, that their leaders are acting on behalf of the U.S. empire. They have politically just devastated and economically Europe. So this thing falls apart. The Europeans are going to be looking, saying, was it worth it? They've lost all credibility. Then when they want to, quote, confront China, who the heck is going to join on board with the neocons for any more adventures anywhere? So all of the credibility of the neocons, they took a big gamble with this Ukraine thing. We think we can do that, and it'll take Russia out. And it's not working, and it's not going to work. And so they've got a tiger by the tail. They can't let go. They can't hold on. And now they're just wrestling with what to do. But this is one of the, let me end up putting it like this. What they've done, I use this analogy. It's like jumping off a cliff. When you're in the air, there's no plan that's going to change the outcome. And they're in the air, they're struggling, they're kicking, they're flapping their arms. You can flap your arms all you want to, but that's not going to change the outcome.
Yeah, because of course, again, I come back to the point, which is that Zelensky came in with a huge shopping list, and he came away with a single Patriot system, which isn't anywhere close to meeting his shopping list. And you're talking about Europe. Now, I'm going to say something which is a bit radical, but I think that the worm of doubt, as we say in Britain, is now very much planted in the heads of a lot of people here. I mean, we've had Sunak in Britain, an incompetent prime minister, in my opinion, almost an invisible prime minister, but he's now commissioned an audit about whether or not, about what we're getting in Britain from our support for Ukraine. Quite a radical thing to do in bureaucratic terms, maybe not a political one, but already apparently that's put him at odds with his neocon defense secretary, Ben Wallace, who's a leftover from the Johnson era. So we're having sort of political tensions starting to grow. And Sunak wouldn't do that if he wasn't under some kind of pressure to do it from some source. Then perhaps much more interesting and more important is Olaf Scholz. Now, until a couple of weeks ago, months ago, it was Robert Habeck and Annalena Baerbock who were making all the running in Germany. I mean, you barely heard about Scholz. I mean, Scholz's job was basically to try and catch up with whatever extreme position Habeck and Baerbock were taking. Now, you suddenly see and hear less of Habeck and Baerbock, and Scholz is suddenly appearing on the scene, and he's calling the Chinese leader. He called Xi Jinping just before Medvedev went to Beijing, for example, trying to get the Chinese to broker a peace agreement with the Russians, or so he says. We see him writing interesting articles in Foreign Affairs, I think it was, or Foreign Policy, one of those places, saying, that we must avoid a Cold War. He makes speeches saying, if we can find a solution to this, well, we can all go back to where we were before. We can have the gas pipelines and the oil pipelines working again. I put aside whether any of that is realistic, but it does suggest to me that some way the balance of the debate within Germany, at least at elite level, is now starting to shift. And if it wasn't the Russians who blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, who was it? And if this comes out in Germany that it was the US, the British, Ukrainians, the Poles, we'll come to the Poles in a moment, well, I think this is going to have an important political effect in Germany.
I think you're right, and I think that something was very important that was said in Joe Biden's speech yesterday. A couple of things, but that a lot of people miss. When he was talking to Zelensky, and he said, I've spent, I don't remember if it was hundreds of hours or many hours talking to the Europeans, basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, telling them you got to stay the course, you got to stay with it, right? Which implies what? That they're saying to him, you don't have to say that. If they're calling up saying, keep going, Joe, we're with you. He might have said hundreds of hours, but whatever, he said a lot of hours. So he made it clear. The Europeans are pushing back on this. He also said the Europeans have said to me, they don't want a war with Russia, right? So we now know he's talking to the Europeans a lot, and they're making it clear. We can't hold on, and we don't want a war with Russia. So it's clear that the Europeans are pushing back a lot. Emmanuel Macron has again said, we have to be concerned. This is the second time he came out a couple months ago or a month or two ago and said we have to eventually make a deal and take into account Russia's security concerns. He got pushed back from, the usual Ukrainians, Arestovich or whatever, you're a Putin bot. He's come out and said it again. Olaf Scholz has said when it comes to when this thing is over, we got to talk to the Russians and we got to do business with the Russians again. They weren't talking to Russia. They were talking to the US empire, I think. They were going privately saying to Joe Biden, as he implied in his speech, we got problems, pal, and this is not working for us. We got to find a way off. Then they're coming out publicly. That was their way of making it clear, not saying this is what I told Joe Biden, but making it clear to Joe Biden, we're going to put these things into the public discussion. We can't change your mind, but it's kind of like it was once said that I believe it was either FDR or LBJ. At any rate, some activist had come and talked to him, and he said, it sounds good. I'm all for it. Now go out there and make me do it. And go out to the public and drive the public to give me the political cover that I need to do it. I tend to think maybe Macron, Olaf Scholz doesn't seem like the most sophisticated politician in the world, but at any rate, I think intuitively they understand, in a way, it's good for them to kind of get pressure, some pressure, so they'll gives them the political cover to go to Joe Biden and say the pressure's too high. So they're going out, creating a dynamic where they get more pressure. They build up the pressure to assist them to go to Biden and push him over the edge and say, we can't do it anymore. Maybe that's reading too much into it, but that's what I think.
I don't think it is reading too much into it. I mean, I absolutely get the sense that that's what's happening. But of course, there is a split in Europe, because at the same time as we see Scholz talking about, finding some way to end the Cold War, we see the Europeans telling Biden, we don't want a war of any kind with the Russians. We see Poland, and we've had a question about this from a viewer, by the way, Poland engaging in some kind of a mobilization. Now, I've been hearing reports about this for a couple of days. Said to myself, this is all coming from the Russians. I'm not going to take it very seriously. It turns out it's absolutely true. And, I'm now getting sources in Poland that are telling me this. And, a famous rock singer has now been called up. And there's this huge Polish force being put together. Now, is this, some people in Washington must know about this. Is this something that Washington is encouraging? Is it something that is just happening and that the Poles are doing it by themselves and that the people in the US are alarmed about it? Is Poland acting like a kind of rogue state, or what is going on? Well, have you any thoughts about this? It's a very difficult situation to read, in my opinion, but what do you make of it all?
I think it goes back to our discussion earlier about discordant voices in various factions. I think that in the same way, we're seeing what's going on in Western Europe. We're seeing the move towards we need an off ramp, right? But meanwhile, you got the Victoria Nulands and the super hawks in the State Department who are saying, "Oh my God, this thing's falling apart on us. What can we do now?" They either travel to or use their back channels to the polls to say, hey, let's start, maybe we can do this or that, and maybe we can stir up some trouble. So I think there are factions in Washington, D.C. There's no doubt more moderate factions that are looking for a way out. I would guess somewhere at minimum, at least in the Pentagon. But I would guess there are moderate factions that are pressuring Biden and looking for an off ramp. At the same time, there are the neocons, the super hawks, the neocons, knowing, as we said earlier, their entire reputation, everything they stand for, everything they want to do. If this falls apart, because if this falls apart, how do they go after China? They can't. There's no possibility. They lose Europe. They lose credibility worldwide. There's no way that they can go after China if and when this thing falls apart. They've been thoroughly discredited. They're in horror. So I do think that there are extremist factions in the U.S. that are aligned with extremist factions in Europe, and by that I mean Poland, and saying, let's try, maybe we can get Poland. They'll do something really, really stupid. These people are every bit as suicidal as the Ukrainians. Maybe we're kind of running out of Ukrainians, really. Sadly, I'm not saying that, but I've said it all along. The neocons have no empathy, no thoughts for human life. So they may say, we're running out of Ukrainians. Hey, but we still got a lot of Poles. We can throw them in the wood chipper. Let's try to we'll get the Poles. And when we both hate to use this term, when the meat grinder runs out of Ukrainians, boom, we'll throw the Poles in there next, because they are enraged and angry enough at the Russians. We can weaponize their rage to use against the Russians and to use against them, so they'll do something that's not in their best interest. And I think that may be what we're looking at.
Maybe right, but I think if that is the thinking, it is a catastrophic miscalculation. I'm going to tell you what I think. If Poland intervenes in Ukraine, it's going to split it's going to split Poland. There's going to be major divisions about this in Poland itself, a country which, without having visited it, I know lots of people from Poland, and I mean, I can tell you this: many of them are anti-Russian in the abstract and perhaps in practical ways, but certainly they would not want to get drawn into a battle with Russia in Ukraine. I mean, that's lots and lots of people in Poland would oppose it. But that pales into the split it will cause in Europe. If the Poles march into Ukraine to fight the Russians, the mood in Berlin, in Germany, I suspect, above all, is just going to go absolutely. I mean, this whole situation is running out of control. All sorts of crazies are now in charge. They're threatening to start World War III. We are not going to come to Poland's rescue if they find themselves in trouble in Ukraine. We're not going to put ourselves, risk our very existence for Poland's adventures in the West, in Western Ukraine. And I think you're going to see a massive and open split in the EU and in NATO over this issue. And I don't know whether people in Washington fully understand that. But I mean, if there is one thing that is going to galvanize opinion in Europe, in the core Europe, Germany, France, especially in Germany, against this whole adventure, it is, as I said, if Poland suddenly becomes involved, and then they start turning to the Germans and saying, if we're in trouble, you must come and save us. I think that is a colossal miscalculation. That's my own personal view.
Yeah, exactly. It goes against what the Europes are screaming first and foremost. We don't want another war that's going to turn this place into a pile of rubble. And I like to use a lot of analogies. I had a friend when I was a young man in my 20s, and you go to bars or whatever, and we'd go to bars and we'd have a couple beers. Well, we'd have a couple beers. I wanted to look at the pretty girls. He wanted to get in a fight. I cut him loose. I couldn't hang out with this guy anymore because I said, you're going to get me beaten up or killed. That's not what I'm trying to accomplish. I think it's kind of the view of Germany and France and the more, and I use this word reticently, responsible. They certainly aren't very responsible, at least more responsible than Poland, Western European nations. They're looking at Poland. I mean, Poland now is screaming at Germany, we want money, $1 trillion back from World War II, things of that nature. I know the Germans are less than thrilled with the position, ideological and political and economic positions of the Poles for any number of reasons. But I do think that you're right. It is the split, because at that point, I think Western Europe says, like I said when I was young, we're here, but we're not here to get in a fight with these people, and they're not going to drag us into it. And it will exacerbate also the split in Washington, because I think you'll have people in the Pentagon screaming at the top of their lungs, hey, these people, what Poland's going to do. They're going to go in there, they're going to get their butts kicked, and they're going to scream Article 5. And the other countries are going to be saying, oh, no, we are not going to trade, Berlin and London for Warsaw. That's just not going to happen. And it's game, set, and match at that point, I think.
Bear in mind that there's already popular revulsions against this in many countries. So Slovakia, the government has fallen, and there's always a split in the political class and popular sentiment. But my wife was recently in the Czech Republic, and she came away with a clear view. And this is in Prague, by the way. And most people there were not happy with the position their government has taken on this. We have our government in Greece going mad, talking about sending an S-300 system to Ukraine, and a Russian S-300 system. Greece doing that, I mean, it'd be completely reckless thing to do. It would really enrage the Russians, and given that the Russians have provided support for this system in the past, that we turn around and backstab them by sending it to Ukraine, and opinion in Greece has shifted. And of course, at the moment, people are very demoralized across Europe for all kinds of reasons. Getting protests going has not been easy, but one does sense that dissatisfaction is growing all the time. It's growing in Britain. We have strikes all the time. We have strikes in the railways. We have strikes in the health service. Ambulance workers are now on strike, which is the first time that's ever happened, by the way. Postal system is on strike. And if you start throwing Ukraine into the mix, if you start making people think that Ukraine is at the core of this, which it is, and the problems we have here, and that the reason these people are on strike is because they're not getting money, and the reason they're not getting money is because we've got ourselves into this situation over Ukraine, well, then you can find yourself in a political situation which you cannot control. And believe me, if Poland marches into Ukraine to fight the Russian army, then I think all that's going to come together very fast and very dangerously. That, at least, is how it looks to me.
Well, this is interesting discussion, because here's what I think we're talking about. Recently, I believe Vladimir Putin said something to the effect of, again, when he was talking about the inability to negotiate a diplomatic settlement with the U.S., he said our interests are incompatible. And I may be paraphrasing, but our interests are incompatible in a way that the wolf and the sheep, they can't come with a deal, because the sheep, not saying that Russia's a sheep by any stretch of the imagination, but they want to tear us apart and take all of our resources. We don't want to be torn apart and have our resources taken. Our interests are incompatible. I think what's interesting, we're also seeing this. The interests of the US and the European states is incompatible, because the US wants to steal their industry and empower itself and re-empower itself industrial. They want to use the Ukrainian people as cannon fodder. They want to use the European people as economic cannon fodder. And if you look at now the interest between Western Europe, let me do it a different way. The interest between the leaders of the European countries and the people of the European countries is becoming incompatible, in that the leaders want to go along with their masters in Washington, and the people of Europe simply want, what human beings want. They want economic security. They want basic security. So I think we're looking at and these things have always been present, these incompatible interests. But now that the U.S. has chosen Ukraine as a battleground, they've chosen this is the chessboard we're going to use to play this game. This is now bearing out all of the interests, and we're seeing the incompatible nature of the interests between the various parties become more obvious.
You've covered lots of things, I think, because we have a limited amount of time. I'm going to call in Alex at this point, if you don't mind. Alex, do you have any points you want to add, or things you want to say?
Well, let's just we have to do a hard stop in about 7 minutes, I think. Yeah, pretty much 5 to 7 minutes. So let's just run through some questions, and if Garland, Alexander, you can let's just try to answer as many questions as we can in this in this last seven minutes or so. All right. Raphael says, Zelensky's visit was a goodbye tour to me. Everything is telling me he is another Samuel Doe. Reagan gave Samuel everything he wanted, then the end.
If I may add this, look what happened in Vietnam, when the Vietnam leader did the same thing. They put him on a U.S. jet. They brought him to the U.S. They marched him around. They went back, and things didn't work out. We know historically things just didn't work out well for him. I'm not implying what could or couldn't happen to Zelensky. I'm just saying we have a historical precedent in Vietnam, the South Vietnam, the Mies president, who did exactly the same thing. And they were like, yay, he's wonderful. We love him. He's the best. And he went back, and let's just say he got fired. We'll put it that way.
From Mr. Wonderful, Ukraine will be under Russian control by the time the first Patriot system is scheduled to be loaded on the first plane.
Well, possibly. I mean, we don't know. I mean, I'm not going to guess about this. By the way, I should say, just going back to that discussion, Garland, that you had with Scott. Scott was skeptical about a Russian advance on Kiev. I have to say I tend to agree. This is based not on my military skills, which are zero, but on what the Russians themselves have been saying. And I do wonder whether this Russian buildup in Belarus isn't a response to this Polish buildup we've just been talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the Russian buildup in Belarus may be a feign, a fake. It may very well be something that they'll use, but it could not be as related to Ukraine as people think it is. It could have to do with the other things going on their border with NATO. It could be a buildup that they intend to maintain, keep permanently. They just said they were going to build up, because of Finland and Sweden, they're going to be building up their border. This could simply be part of that. And it could be part of saying, if NATO decides to get froggy, as we say here in that area, that we will be prepared to defend Belarus and to cement their relation with Belarus and to say to Belarus, look, we want you to be responsible. We're going to give you special weapons and we're going to put real horsepower in your country to let you know we're there. There's any number of things. It could not be not as much related to the Ukraine offenses as some people think.
Yeah.
Ricardo says Zelensky is looking more useful as a martyr than a leader.
Again, I think that goes back to go ahead.
To President Ziem. I will say this about Zelensky. I think if you remember President Ziem, who was just before my time, but I have some memory of him, of people talking about him. I mean, he was a messianic megalomaniac type. I think, and he wasn't prepared to step down. He was prepared to go to meet his death, if you like, to cling on to the presidential position. Zelensky doesn't look like the stuff of martyrs to me. I think he'll be on a plane to Miami as soon as he can, actually. That's my own guess.
He reminds me more of the, what was the guy's name? The U.S. installed president of Afghanistan. I think he ends up, on a plane with bags of money falling out on the tarmac as he takes off. I think that's more the kind of style of Zelensky's style. I mean, that 35, let's face it, we just gave him 40 billion after finding out that they were putting money in a crypto scam.
Yeah.
That's his kind of, he'll be involved in a crypto scam of some type.
Yeah.
Raisi says, what happens to NATO members when the U.S. elite's policy has failed?
I think a lot of governments are going to fall. I think some of these parties that have been around a long time will be turned inside out or completely fall. If somebody comes up with some kind of, as Alexander has said, a reform or some kind of change party, there'll be people jumping out of both parties into this new party because all they're trying to do is just heat their homes and eat. When people get that far, you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When they get down to the basement and they're just trying to heat their homes and and eat, as they say in on the sea, any port in a storm.
Yeah, can I just quickly add to that? I think Garland is absolutely right. If this Ukraine thing ends in a debacle, and everything points to that happening, then this is a crisis in US credibility and a crisis in NATO, the like of which we have not seen since NATO was founded. I mean, that is one of the reasons why it was a massive mistake to invest in this project at all. Alex, I remind you what you said before this even began, that for NATO to stake its entire existence, to die on this particular hill of Ukraine was folly, and we're seeing that every day.
SSSS says NATO Article 5 is a bluff and Russians will soon expose this. The Turks won't join the fighting if Poland is involved directly.
Keep in mind something. Well, one thing I think is important to say. NATO Article 5 is a treaty. It's an agreement that the U.S. is in. And as has been exposed recently, the U.S. doesn't keep any of their promises, any of their treaties, any of their deals. There's no way that the U.S. is going to fight for Poland or any of those other Eastern European countries. They don't keep their deals if it doesn't benefit them. Going to war with Russia won't benefit them. I don't think the U.S. keeps Article 5, which says they have to consider it. It doesn't say they have to come in and fight. It says they have to meet and consider coming in and fight. So it's not a drop dead thing here. No, I don't think the U.S. it's going to keep that anymore, they'll keep any other deals.
Right. Sparky says Ukrainian soldiers in training in the West could be used in a Bay of Pigs style invasion after Russia takes all of Ukraine.
Let them try.
That's what I would say. What are they going to invade?
Yeah,
it's more like the Bay of Piglets in infamous Bay of Piglets invasion in Europe. I mean,
Whitney says why? Whitney says, why don't the Ukrainians overthrow Zelensky?
Because he's not their real president.
Very
it
true.
wouldn't do him any good.
Very true. Let's see. Raphael says the speech Putin gave yesterday, he was not talking to NATO. He was talking straight up to the USA. I said it before. Russia will take on the USA soon.
I'm going to push that back on that. I thought overall that he was talking to his own people. I mean, at one point, he was almost apologizing. As I said, he was saying, look, I did everything I could. I worked really, really hard. Perhaps I went too far in trying to meet these people halfway. And we see where we are, and we've got to do what we've done. So I got the impression that more than any other speech almost on foreign policy I've ever seen, this was almost indifferent to the Western audience.
Yeah, we've got to go, but I'll end by saying this. I think when I read Putin's speeches now, I think he's talking to his people, and a significant portion of his speech is directed towards his allies, towards China, the global South. He's talking to his allies a lot, but part of it is going to be towards the Russian people.
Yeah. All right. So we are going to wrap it up because we are out of time. Eliana says, just to thank you for the work you do. Your minds and voices are very valuable. Merry Christmas.
Yes. Merry Christmas.
That's
Merry
a good
Christmas.
way to wrap up this stream. We're going to answer all the questions in a dedicated video as well. Thank you very much to Garland Nixon for joining us on this stream. Thank you very, very much, Garland, for taking the time out to join us today. And we will have all of Garland's information in the description box down below and as a pinned comment as well. That's it. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to our moderators. Have a great Christmas, everybody.
Yeah.